Four Faultless Felons by G.K. Chesterton. Book 1. The Moderate Murderer. 3. The Man Who Could Not Hate. Immediately after leaving the little garden party, Tom and his tutor parted for the evening, for the former lived at the governorate, while the latter had a sort of lodge or little bungalow higher up on the hill behind amid the taller trees. The tutor said in private what everybody had indignantly expected him to say in public, and remonstrated with the youth for his display of imitative drama. "Well, I won't like him," said Tom warningly. "I'd like to kill him. His nose sticks out." "You can hardly expect it to stick in," said Mr. Hume mildly. "I wonder whether there's an old story about the man whose nose stuck in." "Is there?" demanded the other in the literal spirit of infancy. "There may be tomorrow," replied the tutor, and began to climb the steep path to his abode. It was a lodge built mostly of bamboo and light timber with a gallery running round outside, from which could be seen the whole district spread out like a map. The gray and green squares of the governorate building and grounds, the path running straight under the low garden wall and parallel to the line of villas, the solitary sycamore breaking the line at one point and farther along the closer rank of the olive trees, like a broken cloister, and then another gap and then the corner of the wall, beyond which spread brown slopes of desert, patched here and there with green, where the ground was being turfed as part of some new public works or the deputy governor's rapid reforms in military organization. The whole hung under him like a vast colored cloud in the brief afterglow of the eastern sunset. Then it was rapidly rolled in the purple gloom in which the strong stars stood out over his head and seemed nearer than the things of earth. He stood for some moments on the gallery looking down on the darkening landscape. His blunt features knotted in a frown of curious reflection. Then he went back into the room where he and his pupil had worked all day, or where he had worked to induce his pupil to consider the idea of working. It was a rather bare room, and the few objects in it rather odd and varied. A few bookshelves showed very large and gaily colored books containing the verses of Mr. Edward Lear, and very small and shabby books containing the verses of the principal French and Latin poets. A rack of pipes, all hanging crooked, gave the inevitable touch of the bachelor. A fishing rod and an old double-barreled gun leaned dusty and disused in a corner, for it was long ago that this man, in other ways so remote from the sports of his countrymen, had indulged those two hobbies, chiefly because they were unsociable. But what was perhaps most curious of all, the desk and the floor were littered with geometrical diagrams treated in a manner unusual among geometers, for the figures were adorned with absurd faces or capering legs, such as a schoolboy adds to the squares and triangles on the blackboard. But the diagrams were drawn very precisely, as if the draftsman had an exact eye and excelled in anything depending on that organ. John Hume sat down at his desk and began to draw more diagrams. A little later he lit a pipe and began to study those he had drawn, but he did not leave his desk or his preoccupations. So the hours went by amid an unfathomable stillness around that hillside hermitage, until the distant strains of a more or less lively band floated up from below, as a signal that a dance at the governorate was already in progress. He knew there was a dance that night and took no notice of it. He was not sentimental, but some of the tunes stirred almost mechanical memories. The Talboys family was a little old-fashioned, even for this rather earlier time. They were old-fashioned in not pretending to be any more democratic than they were. Their dependents were dependents, decently treated. They did not call themselves liberal because they dragged their sycophants into society. It had therefore never crossed the mind of the secretary or the tutor that the dance at the governorate was any concern of theirs. They were also old-fashioned in the arrangements of the dance itself, and the date must also be allowed for. The new dances had only just begun to pierce, and nobody had dreamed of the wild and varied freedom of our new fashion, by which a person has to walk about all night with the same partner to the same tune. All this sense of distance, material and moral, in the old swaying waltzes moved through his subconsciousness and must be allowed for in estimating what he suddenly looked up and saw. It seems for one instant as if, in rising through the mist, the tune had taken outline and color and burst into his room with the bodily presence of a song. For the blues and greens of her patterned dress were like notes of music, and her amazing face came to him like a cry. A cry out of the old youth he had lost or never known. A princess flying out of fairyland would not have seemed more impossible than that girl from that ballroom, though he knew her well enough as the younger sister of his charge. And the ball was a few hundred yards away. Her face was like a pale face burning through a dream and itself as unconscious as a dreamer's. For Barbara Trail was curiously unconscious of that mask of beauty fixed on her brooding boyish soul. She had been counted less attractive than her sisters, and her sulks had marked her almost as the ugly duckling. Nothing in the solid man before her told of the shock of realization in his mind. She did not even smile. It was also characteristic of her that she blurted out what she had to say at once, almost as crudely as her brother. "I'm afraid Tom is very rude to you," she said. "I'm very sorry. How do you think he is getting on?" "I think most people would say," he said slowly at last, "that I ought to apologize for his schooling more than you for his family. I'm sorry about his uncle, but it's always a choice of evils. Talboys is a very distinguished man and can look after his own dignity, but I've got to look after my charge. And I know that is the right way with him. Don't you be worried about him. He's perfectly all right if you understand him. And it's only a matter of making up for lost time." She was listening, or not listening, with her characteristic frown of abstraction. She had taken the chair he offered her apparently without noticing it and was staring at the comical diagrams, apparently without seeing them. Indeed, it might well have been supposed that she was not listening at all, for the next remark she made appeared to be about a totally different subject. But she often had a habit of thus showing fragments of her mind, and there was more plan in the jigsaw puzzle than many people understood. "Anyhow," she said suddenly, without lifting her eyes from the ludicrous drawing in front of her, "I met a man going to the governorate today. A big man with a long, fair beard and a single eyeglass. Do you know who he is? He said all sorts of horrid things against England." Hume got to his feet with his hands in his pockets and the expression of one about to whistle. He stared at the girl and said softly, "Hello. Has he turned up again? I thought there was some trouble coming." "Yes, I know him. They call him Dr. Gregory, but I believe he comes from Germany, though he often passes for English. He is a stormy petrel, anyhow, and wherever he goes there's a row. Some say we ought to have used him ourselves. I believe he once offered his talents to our government. He's a very clever fellow and knows a frightful lot of the facts about these parts." "Do you mean," she said sharply, "that I'm to believe that man and all the things he said?" "No," said Hume. "I shouldn't believe that man, not even if you believe all the things he said." "What do you mean?" she demanded. "Frankly, I think he is a thoroughly bad egg," said the tutor. "He's got a pretty rotten reputation about women. I won't go into details, but he'd have gone to prison twice but for suborning perjury. I only say, whatever you may come to believe, don't believe in him." "He dared to say that our government broke its word," said Barbara indignantly. John Hume was silent. Something in his silence affected her like a strain, and she said quite irrationally, "Oh, for the Lord's sake say something. Do you know he dared to say that somebody on Lord Jaffrey's expedition shot a child? I don't mind their saying England's cold and hard and all that. I suppose that's natural prejudice. But can't we stop these wild, wicked lies?" "Well," replied Hume rather wearily, "nobody can say that Jaffrey is cold and hard. The excuse for the whole thing was that he was blind drunk. Then I am to take the word of that liar," she said fiercely. "He's a liar all right," said the tutor gloomily. "And it's a very dangerous condition of the press and the public when only the liars tell the truth." Something of a massive gravity in his grim humor for the moment overpowered her breathless resentment, and she said in a quieter tone, "Do you believe in this demand for self-government?" "I'm not very good at believing," he said. "I find it very hard to believe that these people cannot live or breathe without votes, when they lived contentedly without them for 50 centuries when they had the whole country in their own hands. A parliament may be a good thing. A top hat may be a good thing. Your uncle certainly thinks so. We may like or dislike our top hats. But if a wild Turk tells me he has a natural-born right to a top hat, I can't help answering, then why the devil didn't you make one for yourself? You don't seem to care much for the nationalists either, she said. Their politicians are often frauds, but they're not alone in that. That's why I find myself forced into an intermediate position, a sort of benevolent neutrality. It simply seems to be a choice between a lot of blasted blackguards and a lot of damn driveling, doddering idiots. You see, I'm a moderate. He laughed a little for the first time, and his plain face was suddenly altered for the better. She was moved to say in a more friendly tone, "Well, we must prevent a real outbreak. You don't want all our people murdered." "Only a little murdered," he said, still smiling. "Yes, I think I should like some of them rather murdered. Not too much, of course. It's a question of a sense of proportion." "Now you're talking nonsense," she said. "And people in our position can't stand any nonsense. Harry says we may have to make an example." "I know," he said. "He made several examples when he was in command here, before Lord Talboys came out. It was vigorous, very vigorous. But I think I know what would be better than making an example." "And what is that?" "Setting an example," said Hume. "What about our own politicians?" She said suddenly, "Well, why don't you do something yourself?" There was a silence. Then he drew a deep breath. "Ah, there you have me. I can't do anything myself. I am futile, naturally and inevitably futile. I suffer from a deadly weakness." She felt suddenly rather frightened. She had encountered his blank and empty eyes. "I cannot hate," he said. "I cannot be angry." Something in his heavy voice seemed full of quality, like the fall of a slab of stone on a sarcophagus. She did not protest, and in her subconsciousness yawned a disappointment. She half realized the depth of her strange reliance and felt like one who had dug in the desert and found a very deep well and found it dry. When she went out onto the veranda, the steep garden and plantation were gray in the moon, and a certain grayness spread over her own spirit, a mood of fatalism and of dull fear. For the first time, she realized something of what strikes a Western eye in Eastern places as the unnaturalness of nature. The squat, limbless growth of the prickly pear was not like the green growths of home, springing on light stalks to lovely flowers like butterflies captured out of air. It was more like the dead blind bubbling of some green, squalid slime, a world of plants that were as plain and flat as stones. She hated the hairy surface of some of the squat and swollen trees of that grotesque garden. The tufts here and there irritated her fancy as they might have tickled her face. She felt that even the big, folded flowers, if they opened, would have a foul fragrance. She had a latent sense of the savor of faint horror, lying over all as lightly as the faint moonshine, just as it had chilled her most deeply. She looked up and saw something that was neither plant nor tree, though it hung as still in the stillness. But it had the unique horror of a human face. It was a very white face, but bearded with gold like the Greek statues of gold and ivory, and at the temples were two golden curls. That might have been the horns of Pan. For the moment that motionless head might indeed have been that of some terminal god of gardens. But the next moment it had found legs and came to life, springing out upon the pathway behind her. She had already gone some distance from the hut and was not far from the illuminated grounds of the governorate, whence the music swelled louder as she went. Nevertheless, she swung round and faced the other way, looking desperately at the figure she recognized. He had abandoned his red fez and black frock coat and was clad completely in white, like many tropical trippers, but it gave him in the moonlight something of the silver touch of a spectral harlequin. As he advanced, he screwed the shining disk into his eye, and it revealed in a flash the faint memory that had always escaped her. His face in repose was calm and classic and might have been the stone mask of Jove rather than Pan. But the monocle gathered up his features into a sneer and seemed to draw his eyes closer together. And she suddenly saw that he was no more a German than an Englishman. And though she had no anti-Semitic prejudice in particular, she felt somehow that in that scene there was something sinister in a fair Jew, as in a white Negro. "We meet under a yet more beautiful sky," he said. She hardly heard what else he said. Broken phrases from what she had heard recently tumbled through her mind. Mere words like reputation and prison, and she stepped back to increase the distance, but moving in the opposite direction from which she had come. Afterwards, she hardly remembered what had happened. He had said other things. He had tried to stop her, and an instantaneous impression of crushing and startling strength, like a chimpanzee, surprised her into a cry. Then she stumbled and ran, but not in the direction of the house of her own people. Mr. John Hume got out of his chair more quickly than was his wont, and went to meet someone who stumbled up the stair without. "My dear child," he said, and put a hand on her shaking shoulder, giving and receiving a queer thrill like a dull electric shock. Then he went, moving quickly past her. He had seen something in the moonlight beyond, and without descending the steps, sprang over the rail to the ground below. Standing waist-high in the wild and tangled vegetation, there was a screen of large leaves waving to and fro between Barbara and the rapid drama that followed. But she saw, as in flashes of moonlight, the tutor dart across the path of the figure in white, and heard the shock of blows and saw a kick like a catapult. There was a wheel of silver legs like the arms of the Isle of Man, and then out of the dense depth of the lower thicket a spout of curses in a tongue that was not English, nor wholly German, but which shrieked and chattered in all the ghettos of the world. But one strange thing remained even in her disordered memory, that when the figure in white had risen tottering and turned to plunge down the hill, the white face and the furious gesture of malediction were turned, not towards the assailant, but towards the house of the governor. The tutor was frowning ponderously as he came again up the veranda steps, as if over some of his geometrical problems. She asked him rather wildly what he had done, and he answered in his heavy voice, "I hope I half killed him. You know I am in favor of half measures." She laughed rather hysterically and cried, "You said you could not be angry." Then they suddenly became very stiff and silent, and it was with an almost fatuous formality that he escorted her down the slope to the very doors of the dancing rooms. The sky behind the green pergolas of foliage was a vivid violet, or some sort of blue that seemed warmer than any red, and the furry filaments of the great tree trunks seemed like the quaint sea beasts of childhood, which could be stroked and which unfolded their fingers. There was something upon them both beyond speech or even silence. He even went so far as to say it was a fine night. "Yes," she answered, "it is a fine night," and felt instantly as if she had betrayed some secret. They went through the inner gardens to the gate of the vestibule, which was crowded with people in uniform and evening dress. They parted with the utmost formality, and that night neither of them slept.